the 4 Middle East wars actually ended with a ceasefire after about 2 weeks of fighting. The combat stopped with Israel pushing back Egypt and Syria slightly. After this conflict, long negotiations took place between Israel and Egypt towards peace. This time, I would like to explore the process that led to the historic agreement between Israel and Egypt.
In the Third Middle East War, Israel occupied the Sinai Peninsula, rendering the Suez Canal practically unusable. For Egypt, which had nationalized the Suez Canal during the Second Middle East War, this was a significant blow. The Fourth Middle East War was primarily aimed at Egypt and Syria, each reclaiming the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, respectively, from Israeli occupation. The Sinai Peninsula was crucial for the proper operation of the Suez Canal, and the Golan Heights was important for securing the source of the Jordan River. Particularly for Egypt, the permanent Israeli occupation of the Sinai Peninsula was unacceptable due to the substantial loss of revenue it caused. Egypt, in consultation with Syria, devised a strategy to simultaneously attack from the north and south to disperse Israel's military forces. Egypt's primary objective was to reclaim the Sinai Peninsula, but it did not engage Israel in a one-on-one battle. Instead, it persuaded the Syrian president to launch a two-front attack. Egypt's strategy targeted Israel on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when reservists and others were in synagogues, making it a surprise attack. Additionally, Egypt negotiated with Saudi Arabia to shift the confrontation from an Egypt-Israel conflict to an Arab-Israel one, securing cooperation from Arab countries. Saudi Arabia influenced OPEC to decide not to supply oil to any Western countries aiding Israel. This decision coincided with the battle for the Sinai Peninsula, deterring Western nations. OPEC's oil production cuts led to a spike in oil prices, causing the global oil shock. Initially, Egypt broke through Israel's defenses as planned, appearing poised to reclaim the Sinai Peninsula. However, Egypt halted its advance at a point 12 kilometers from where anti-aircraft guns could reach, responding to Syria's incursion. This angered Syria, which sought assistance from the Soviet Union. Under Soviet pressure, Egypt resumed its advance but suffered defeat.
Israel requested aid from the United States, using satellite data to track Egyptian movements. This enabled Israel to launch a counteroffensive, pushing back the Egyptian forces. Similarly, in the Golan Heights, Israel quickly repelled Syrian tank forces. About 2 weeks after the fighting began, a ceasefire was decided by the United Nations and implemented.
Egypt's demands were the return of the Sinai Peninsula, recognition of Arab sovereignty over Jerusalem, the return of the Golan Heights, and a return to the pre-Third Middle East War conditions. At that time, Israel's prime minister was Golda Meir, who showed no willingness to comply with Egypt's conditions. Soon after, the Israeli government changed, and Egypt's new negotiating counterpart became Menachem Begin. Egypt's representative remained President Sadat throughout the negotiations. Begin, believing that Israel held the advantage even if the ceasefire was lifted, engaged in tough negotiations.
While Egypt, representing the Arab world, desired the reclamation of Jerusalem, the focus increasingly shifted to the Sinai Peninsula and its connection to the Suez Canal due to Israel's firm diplomatic stance. Israel had begun settling in the Sinai Peninsula, making its return to Egypt increasingly difficult as time passed. Sadat sought help from the United States.
Israeli Prime Minister Begin was the toughest negotiator for President Sadat of Egypt. Begin had no intention of giving up even a millimeter of the Sinai Peninsula. In this stalemate, Sadat made a bold declaration in a speech to the Egyptian parliament, stating that he was willing to go to the Israeli parliament and speak directly. He expressed his desire to visit Israel and converse with Israeli leaders, even if he had to go alone. This announcement surprised Egyptian politicians and citizens, but it was met with great applause in parliament. Israel announced its willingness to receive Sadat, and his visit to Israel became a reality. This courageous act excited the Israeli public, and Sadat was welcomed like a hero when he arrived at the airport. When Sadat finally began his speech in the Israeli parliament, He demanded the return of the Sinai Peninsula and Jerusalem to the Arabs. However, none of the Israelis agreed with his demands. The Egyptian side held high-level talks, hoping to achieve some success from Sadat's visit.
However, the gap between the two sides was difficult to bridge, and frequent meetings were held between Egypt and Israel for over 7 months. Frustrated by the lack of progress in these negotiations, Sadat sought assistance from the United States.
At the time, the President of the United States was Democrat Jimmy Carter. When Egyptian President Sadat requested mediation, all of Carter's cabinet members were opposed. However, Carter hoped that if Egypt and Israel could restore diplomatic relations, it might lead to a resolution of the broader Arab-Israeli conflict. Thus, he decided to undertake the mediation. Carter envisioned the discussions not in a formal parliamentary setting, but at Camp David, a retreat where participants could exchange views in a relaxed, informal atmosphere, without uniforms or ties. Carter first listened to Sadat's opinions, which were completely unacceptable to Israel. The negotiations immediately broke down, and Egypt and Israel did not hold talks for the next 10 days. Carter concluded that the United States had to provide a compromise solution.
Carter shuttled back and forth between Begin's and Sadat's bungalows, trying to come up with a compromise. However, he realized that making the West Bank, including Jerusalem, an Arab land was impossible. Carter persuaded Sadat to abandon the idea of establishing an Arab state in those territories. This decision later led to significant friction, branding Egypt as a traitor among the Arab nations.
Prime Minister Begin insisted on not returning the Sinai Peninsula, adhering to Israel's policy of not losing anything. Seeing no resolution without the return of the Sinai Peninsula, Sadat prepared to return to Egypt. Carter managed to persuade Sadat to stay. In the end, Carter directly called the settlers in the Sinai Peninsula, securing an agreement to dismantle the settlements. The Israeli parliament agreed to return the Sinai Peninsula. Thus, Egypt regained the Sinai Peninsula and, in exchange, recognized the State of Israel. Egypt became the first and only Islamic and Arab nation to make peace with Israel. However, the issue of reclaiming Jerusalem, demanded by the Arab states, was postponed, leading to disappointment among many Arab nations. Some Arab groups viewed the peace between Egypt and Israel with anger.
Following this, the United States allocated substantial funds and military support to both Israel and Egypt. By facilitating the return of the Sinai Peninsula, the U.S. enabled Egypt to quickly establish friendly relations with democratic nations within the Islamic world. As a result, the U.S., Egypt, and Israel jointly ensured the secure and effective operation of the Suez Canal, achieving significant success.
The world welcomed the peace between Egypt and Israel favorably. However, from the moment the peace agreement was signed, protests by Arab groups opposed to the peace erupted. And despite President Carter's mediation efforts, Egypt was ostracized from the Arab world. In 1978, Egyptian President Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Begin were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The peace treaty between Egypt and Israel was considered a historic achievement due to the severe tensions between Arabs and Israelis. However, in reality, there were factions in both Egypt and Israel opposed to the treaty, leading to intense internal resistance. 2 years after the agreement, President Sadat was attending a military parade, when terrorists infiltrated the marching soldiers and opened fire. Many people, including President Sadat, were killed in the attack. The group responsible for the assassination of President Sadat was one of the Islamic extremist organizations, and they were apprehended and arrested on the spot.
Their gunfire also resulted in 11 other victims, highlighting to the world the presence of uncontrollable terrorist organizations within Islamic states. Following this, Israel held talks with the PLO, Saddam Hussein of Iraq, and the Shah of Iran. After the Camp David Accords, the Oslo Accords were signed with the PLO in 1993, and a peace treaty with Jordan was signed in 1994. Jordan became the second Arab country to make peace with Israel, following Egypt. This agreement included a promise of water supply from Israel. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel.